Hello and good evening to you all. I'm Meshal Manisha, and the topic which I have chosen for today's presentation is exploitation of indentured women migrants in Fiji. The aim for this presentation will discuss the struggles and the inhumane conditions which the indentured women migrants went through while they stay in Fiji. Moving on to the introduction. During the indenture system, there were about 2 million Indian laborers being transported to many places over the world, such as the Caribbean, Natal, South Africa, Reunion, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Myanmar, and to Fiji. And this has led to the growth of the Indo-Caribbean, Indo-African, Indo-Fijian, and Indo-Melanesian and Indo-Singaporean population. Over 60,500 laborers who were transported to the Fiji Islands over a period of 37 years, which started from the year 1875 and ended in 1916, to work on the plantations of Fiji. Later, the trade had ended in the 19th century. The system expanded after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833. In the French colonies in 1848 and in the Dutch Empire in 1863. Indian indentureship lasted till the 1920s. Girmitias or indentured laborers is the name given to the Indian who had left India in the middle of the late 19th century to serve as laborers in the British colonies, where the majority eventually had settled. Girmit is an informal form of the English word girmit. A labor immigrating under the agreement of or girmit was called a girmitia. Girmit, which was the term used by the Indian indentures for the word agreement. Indians first arrived into Fiji as indentured laborers on the board by the ship named Leonidas in 1879. Since their arrival in the British colony as sugar plantation, the rights of the women laborers were exploited. They went there in search of livelihood to find a better world, but in return they faced a kind of oppression or similar kind of oppression which they had faced in their native place. On the slide, there is a picture of the immigration passes which they had used to enter Fiji and the other countries. Moving on to the struggles faced by the Indian women. According to the rule of the Indian emigration, a fixed ratio of women to men, despite that after the 1870s ratio was 40 men per 100 men. Different colonies had different expectations, while some only wanted the unmarried men for economic reasons, while others needed women to produce local laborers. Though the recruiters faced many challenges in recruiting unmarried young women, the ratio was met. Of the 13,696 Indian indentured women who departed for Fiji from Calcutta, 3,659, which would be 26.7% of all the females, came as members of the families. The majority, which would make up to 68.6%, accompanying their husbands, and the rest with their children or with their husbands and children. Women, however, were not treated well. Apart from living in appalling conditions, they were expected to return back to work on the farms after giving birth to children. This, except from Mr. Brijlal's book Girmitius, The Origins of the Fiji Indians, discusses the story of Kunti and Narayani. The minimal wages offered by the crown to a laborer was 1 shilling a day. In comparison, this was 4 to 5 times higher than those offered locally to unskilled labor. Gillian suggests that these nominal wages were not always earned by immigrants. The attraction of the high wages undoubtedly acted as an inducement to immigrant when the recruiter approached the prospective immigrant. It is interesting to note that by this time the villager had already left his home for reasons not connected with immigration or the level of wages. The overseers had treated men badly, but they had treated women even in a worse condition. They were made to live in the filthy environments, and also they were made to live in unclean, unsanitary hovels with animals kept in the house that increased the risk of disease, as reported by Burton in his book. As discussed by Dr. Brijlal in the text, that while the colonial regime in Fiji recruited fit men, they had neglected the number of women, which created the competition for sexual partners, which resulted in murder. Dr. Brijlal notes that in the case of Fiji, a total of 13,696 females and 31,458 males were brought to Fiji during the period of indentured emigration. These women had fled due to the social scorn or caste system. The women were both exploited by the male laborers and the overseers. They were harassed and abused while living in coolie lines to fight for their izzat. That is a Hindu term, or honor in English. The indentured women had held the protest. According to Brijlal, during the period of 1885 to 1920, the indentured immigrants in Fiji were murdered, out of whom 68 were women and 28 were men. The women were manipulated by being told that they will be paid minimum of 9 annas per day for a completed task, and they will be required to work on farms. They had never thought that the life in Fiji is going to be so difficult because they had been used to working in farms in their own country. But it was a different story. The contract was not made in the favor of the laborers, and these village women did not know what they were getting themselves into. Moving on to the heroic tales of the two women. This has been taken from the text Girmitius, The Origins of Fiji by Dr. Brijlal. The stories of the treatment of two Fiji Indian women, Kunti and Narayani, attracted special attention, and their names are remembered in Fiji even today. Kunti, a 20-year-old woman from Lakwapur village in Gorakhpur, had emigrated to Fiji with her husband in 1908. Her first 4 years on the plantation were exceptional until 10th April 1912, when the overseer allocated Kunti an isolated patch in a banana field away from all the other workers, apparently with the intention of molesting her sexually. Kunti resisted his demands until, nearly overtaken, she jumped into the river in desperation. She was, however, rescued by a boy, Jaidev. Kunti's story was published in the Bharat Mitra and became widely known, which prompted the government of India to ask the government of Fiji to institute an inquiry into the treatment of indentured Indian women. Narayani's plight was equally sorry, if less sensational. The overseer of an estate in Nadi asked Narayani to present herself at work 3 to 4 days after giving birth to a dead child. Narayani refused, arguing correctly that it was the recognized practice for women to be absent themselves for hard labor for up to 3 months after giving birth. The overseer, taking umbrage at Narayani's refusal, then beat her severely. Barely able to walk, Narayani was carried to hospital on a stringed bed. The overseer was arrested, and the case came before the Supreme Court of Fiji. But much to everyone's surprise, the consternation, he was found not guilty and acquitted. Narayani later lost her senses and spent the rest of her life as an insane vagrant. According to Brijlal, the story of Kunti was widely circulated both in India and Fiji and gave impetus to the anti-indenture movement. The abuse and harassment of both women had caused the rise of the anti-indenture movement. Moving on to the next slide. The abolishment of the indenture system. Indentured women, especially those in Fiji, unwittingly played a very large part in the movement to abolish the indenture system. The Indian public had for a long time been aware of the sorry plight for the Indian laborers overseas, but it was the news of the molestation and abuse of Indian women on the plantations that outraged them the most. The campaigns in India to stop the degradation of Indian women in the colonies received wider public support than any other movement in the Indian history. More even than the government had supported for the movement for independence. The government of India, which had been under pressure for some time from the Indian nationalists to end the system, finally moved and waving away protests from the colonial planters abolished the indenture system in 1916. However, by 1920, India had exhausted all avenues for acquiring labor, and the indentured system had a growing social and economic force in Fiji and utilized organizational skills acquired during indenture to lead counter-hegemonic movements against the colonial government. During the years from 1920 to 1921 and 1943, also 1960, the Indo-Fijian activists demanded political equality with the colonizers. They had demanded better wages and proper living conditions by conducting strikes and boycotts. I have reached towards the end of my presentation. To conclude, the Indians have struggled a great deal during the indenture system while in Fiji, specifically women migrants who had known what was going to be their future in the island of Fiji. With the heroic tales of some women, it had encouraged the women of the past and the women of today to get familiarized with their rights. This has helped them to confront those people who have been exploiting them and who might abuse them in future. Thank you for listening.